And now we're moving on, continuing with the very same topic. And we're going to hear from Susan Harrison. Susan is a radical feminist and a recently retired social worker with 35 years working in child protection and adult safeguarding. And the title of her presentation is The Frank Beck Case, a look back to the Leicester Beck case and some common factors of child sexual abuse and exploitation. So thank you very much, Susan, for being here with us, and over to you.
So I'm going to talk about a case. It was known as the Frank Beck case, although most properly it should have been known as the Leicestershire child abuse case. And that was down really to a kind of a press strategy to keep the name Leicestershire, which was the local authority concerned, out of the headlines. So to this day, it's still referred to as the Beck case. So this actually goes back right to the beginning of my social work training, actually, which was, I started training in 1986, a 2-year MA course. And I was starting to hear rumours at that stage, although didn't appreciate the full significance of them until some time later. So it was really after all the recent coverage that we've seen around, the so-named grooming gangs in the north of England, and the interest, on many platforms and amongst many women about the sexual abuse and exploitation of children, I was taken back to think about this case again. And I thought it would be useful to, I found myself kind of going back and reading up on it a bit more and learning a bit more about it, and including things I didn't actually know at the time. So the information that I'm going to share with you is from a range of sources, which includes press reports during the trial, which was in 91, personal accounts from some of the victims themselves, other staff members and witnesses that were shared previously. And also there was a book called The Abuse of Trust, which was written by a journalist, I think he was a BBC journalist, Mark Darcy, and a man called Paul Gosling, who I knew kind of, I was acquainted with him, I didn't know him very well. And that was published in 1997 and contains a lot of the detail about what happened. On the 29th of November in 1991, following an 11-week trial at the Leicester Crown Court, Frank Beck was sentenced to 5 life terms for sexual and physical assaults against more than 100 children that had been in his care. And he was also sentenced to a further 24 years on 17 charges of abuse, which included rape, buggery, indecent assault, and assault carried out between 73 and 1986, so a long period of time. Most of Beck's victims were boys, but he also abused some girls, and he was renowned for his extreme misogyny and hatred of girls and women. The 5 life-term sentence was, I think it still remains one of the most severe in British judicial history since the ending of the death penalty for murder. And it was unprecedented at the time, certainly. Initially, the trial was to be held in secret, I think because of the sensitivity of some of the information that it was feared would come to light. But there was a landmark case brought by several newspapers, and this ruling was actually overturned, so it was a public trial. So Beck died on the 31st of May 1994, 2.5 years after he'd been imprisoned, apparently as a result of a heart attack whilst he was playing badminton, and he was just 52. There was speculation at the time and subsequently that he may have been murdered, and that's never been proven. And in fact, the inquest concluded that he'd had a heart attack, but would not reveal whether there'd even been a post-mortem. So there's no way of knowing that now. The investigation into Beck began 3 years earlier in 1989. And this was after a mother who was being questioned about her own parenting. And she disclosed that she'd been abused as a child when she was in a care home that was run by Beck. This eventually led to a very large-scale police investigation, which involved tracing and interviewing dozens of children who'd been in care during the 1970s and 1980s. So very, very extensive. There were also 2 other members of staff who were co-accused alongside Beck, and there was a 3rd man who would have been charged, called Colin Fidderman, but he actually went on the run and he took his own life. And I'll touch on him again later. So at that time, this was the biggest investigation into child sexual abuse that there'd been. So, understandably, there was a huge amount of interest in it. 3 years earlier, so that was 1986, so it was just as I was commencing my training, Beck had resigned as head of 3 children's homes in Leicestershire. And he'd been head of officer in charge, it was called, of these homes between 1974 and 1986. And there were several homes in the county that he had oversight over, or was actually the officer in charge of. But more importantly than that, he actually gained the status of a guru, and he was a self-appointed expert on dealing with what were then termed difficult children. And one person referred to him as the trusted supremo of children's homes in Leicestershire. So, we're seeing this kind of familiar thing now where somebody gains a situation where they have huge respect, influence, and in his case, a kind of authority and seniority that went way beyond his actual role, which was actually quite junior in the hierarchy, but because of his personal authority that he exercised. He became very important in actually shaping childcare policy throughout Leicestershire. He used to chair a council working party that dealt with the children's homes. That was in 1977. And he had the ear of those in power and the confidence of people in power, including politicians. One of the things that Beck did was pioneer the introduction of what was called a treatment for disturbed children, known as regression therapy. And under this therapy, children were reduced to a state of isolation, of intense fear and self-doubt. And in that state, they were very, very vulnerable to abuse and were abused. And an element of this so-called therapy was also to provoke the children to the point where they would lose control and then could be restrained. And that was also seen as an accepted part of this intervention. As well as the children that he abused, Beck also abused at least four members of staff, adults, over several years. And until they did finally speak out, they were also very, very fearful of him and felt powerless to stop him or to report him. And he was also charged with offences against at least 2 of those people. During the trial, it was described that he'd run what was called a reign of terror over 13 years. And a man, Peter Joyce, who was a QC for the prosecution, said that it was no way of life for these children. There was no escape for these children. There was simply the endurance of it. And one can only imagine, how awful that must have been, because there was literally no escape. They were in care, supposedly being looked after. If they ran away, they'd be returned. They couldn't go back to their own families because they were in care. So, they were in an absolutely desperate situation. And Beck was responsible for creating this very powerful regime. And it was actually a kind of closed system. So there was little outside scrutiny. And in those days, there would have been limited scrutiny in any case. But even with what there should have been, didn't actually occur because he put so many barriers in the way. He would not comply with any departmental procedures. He would not cooperate with the field social workers or other colleagues in other departments. And his managers felt completely unable to manage him or control him in any way. They were also intimidated by him. And that, again, that's a familiar, scenario that, we see now with many people. I think it was probably not so evident at that time. People would not have recognised that in the way I hope they would now. So there was an expert witness who at a compensation hearing. So this was some years after the trial, when some of the victims were trying to secure compensation. And this person said that, in his view, it appeared that what was happening was actually torture. It went beyond what we would normally see as abuse. And it was torture. It was a psychological and physical hurt that was intended to subjugate the victims and gain mastery over them so that they became dependent. And again, I think, that was true of both the adult and child victims. He fostered this dependency. The regression therapy, senior managers were said to be aware of it. So it was kind of it wasn't only just known about, it was actually kind of applauded and seen as very innovative. Despite concerns being repeatedly raised about the methods, and actually if anyone had looked deeper, he just completely bluffed his way into this. He knew very little about therapeutic training. He'd had no training himself. It was just really a cover. And at one point, the managers actually started to become more aware, and they said that this methodology should not be carried out in the homes that Beck managed. But actually, they then failed to take action on any further complaints, and they didn't go and check. So, they just left it to him. And of course, he just ignored that instruction. One of the, I think the factors, and again, this is very, very true today, is that the children who'd come into care for very, very many different reasons. I mean, some of them have been involved in criminal behaviour. Some of them simply had parents that were unable to care for them. But because they were in care and because of their previous histories, they weren't held in high regard by adults generally. So they were often stigmatised. They were seen as being criminals. And we know sometimes children are actually involved and enticed into criminal activity in order to make them less plausible if they ever do complain. Because the police or CPS will just think, oh, well, you wouldn't be a good witness because of that. And these children were completely isolated from their families, more isolated than would normally be the case, or indeed other adults like teachers who may have helped them. And again, that was part of Beck's aim, to completely overpower these children, to reduce their own thoughts and opinions and views, and just undermine them in every way possible. And I should say as well, the Beaches home, which is one of the homes he went on to manage towards the end of his career, had its own school as well, so children didn't even get to leave to go to schools outside. So before I go on, I just want to read a few words from the children themselves, because I think it's so important that we hear some of their experiences and their views, which were really not listened to at the time. So what one former resident said: "You were treated worse if you had no backup from others. My mum was banned from visiting because she was supposed to be a bad influence, and they told me she didn't care about me and didn't want me." Another resident said, "You would be taken to your room with no one around, and they would taunt you about your childhood, your parents, your sexuality, anything they could think of to get at you. Eventually you'd react and they would pounce on you." She said that children were held down, and sometimes towels were placed around their necks or pillows were held over their faces. It was horrific. You felt terrified before it happened. And when it was over, you felt good because you knew you were safe, at least for a couple of days. She said, "I will never, never forget what happened in that kid's home." Another said, "If he came into a room, you wouldn't have to look around to know it was him. He wouldn't have to speak. He had this kind of aura and you could feel him like static. He was charismatic. There was this real sense of authority, as if he had the power of life or death over you. You would be called into the office and told you were nothing to society. You had no dad. You were a bastard, a slag, a whore." So I'm just going to go on to outline some of the concerns that were raised and the events that actually led to his resignation. So as early as 1975, there was a Labour councillor called Henry Dunphy, and he received an anonymous phone call alleging that children were being seriously mistreated at Ratcliffe Road Children's Home. And he reported it to the Director of Social Services, so he went right to the top. And then he was visited by two senior officers from Social Services, and they reassured him that not to worry, all was well. They were aware of what was going on, and it was all part of the therapy going on. So again, you can see how this therapy was used as a cover. And Beck himself would say, oh, well, children may make allegations, because that's part of what will happen. So they just dismissed it. Now, this man said, he might have been reassured by that, but then he got a threatening phone call from Beck himself. Now, this is a lowly officer who actually rang a counsellor, which would be unheard of, So he rang him, and that was very odd behaviour from an employee to a counsellor. So the counsellor actually, he followed up with a visit to the home. He was very tenacious, and he found Beck to be a very imposing character and using what he termed controlled aggression. I should say, I won't have time to say much or anything about Beck's background, but he had actually been a member of the Royal Marines for about 7 years, I think. And he was also, he used interrogation techniques during his time in the Marines. And I think some of the things he did were probably learned during that period of his life. And he was then working in a children's home. So Beck defended his approach, and after wowing the Social Services Committee, he gave a presentation about his innovative approach to caring for these troubled children. And he got their full endorsement. And at that point, he seemed invincible. I think at that time, the council wasn't sure how to deal with, what they saw as very difficult children with lots of needs and difficult behaviours. And Beck seemed to get results. So it was kind of like, oh, great, we don't have to, we can leave that to him. They just looked the other way, basically. Probably very naively, I think, rather than maliciously, although that may not have been the case with every single one of the people that were in charge. But in 1977, there was a young boy, aged just 13, called Simon O'Donnell, and he was actually, he was found hanged. And it was, I think the inquest found that he'd hanged himself. However, other children at the home, including one who later went on to commit murder, he murdered a child later. He said that this, he'd seen the body of this boy being removed, but because of his own criminality, nobody really took it very seriously. But that, he wasn't the only one who sort of cast doubt on that. And probably, my own personal view is on the balance of what we kind of know. It was highly likely that this child had been killed because of what we know about throttling children and just the severity of the abuse that took place. And it was unlikely that he would run away to where he was found. So that that did lead, obviously led to some concerns about what was going on, but not sufficient to really do anything. And then in 1980, there was a foster parent, so I'll just call JW. She raised concerns about the treatment of her 11-year-old foster daughter. And Beck would visit this child in the foster carer's home to give her counselling sessions. And the foster carer was told, on no account must you go upstairs, no matter what happens. And this young child would scream and scream and scream and be very distressed, and her behaviour really kind of worsened. And the foster carer was so concerned that she actually made an in-person visit to the Director of Social Services and turned up at their door. But again, her concerns were dismissed. 2 years later, in 82, Beck was arrested and he was charged with ABH on a 10-year-old boy. And this boy had actual injuries to his buttocks after being struck by Beck. This child actually wasn't even in care, but he was staying at the beaches at weekends. On an informal arrangement, and even at that time, that would be very odd to have such an arrangement in place. So Beck should have been suspended because this went to trial, and he should have been placed on suspension. But amazingly, the HR department at the time concluded that he posed no risk to children, so he was still in work. And at the trial, the court ruled that the chastisement was reasonable and acquitted Beck of the charges. So he, there he was. And then later that same year, there was a student social worker on placement, and she complained about the treatment of a girl who'd been dragged around by her hair and struck around the head. And she was very concerned, and she kind of raised these issues. And the manager was asked to investigate this. He was in this kind of line manager. He was a line manager, I think, of Beck. But he failed to actually speak to either the girl herself or the social work student. And often what would happen was people would just speak to Beck, and of course he had every excuse. So there's this consistent failure to speak to children, which in my mind is just willful, not wanting to hear what they might hear if they did. So these children really were just abandoned to their fate. And then in November of that very same year, another junior social worker who was working at the beaches filed a complaint, and she'd been there for about 18 months. And she gave a detailed account of her concerns over that period of time. And again, she tried initially to go to the director, right to the top, because she realised that things might get blocked, kind of lower down. But she was referred to the principal officer, which was a sort of relatively senior post, about 3 tiers up from Beck and below the director. And her concerns included physical violence, also suspected sexual abuse of boys, and also the verbal abuse of staff, including herself. So she'd been called, racist slurs, sexist slurs on a regular basis, and she'd witnessed other staff suffering the same. And women particularly were the most insulted by Beck. He really didn't like women, so, and he encouraged the children not to respect female staff. And at that time, there were 2 other adult witnesses to this who confirmed these allegations, so you'd think that would be sufficient to trigger a major investigation. But yet again, the children were not spoken with and no action was taken. So in February the following year, I think Beck had been on bail while those other, for the first charge. So after he was acquitted in February 83, he was actually approved as a foster carer for 2 teenage boys who were living at the beaches. And when I read that, I was utterly incredulous, really, that should happen. And this was despite concerns also being raised by the father of one of these boys, who had come to suspect that another child was being sexually abused by Beck. But his concerns were kind of overlooked. And then in June that same year, 83, a 14-year-old girl absconded, and she told the police that Beck had hit her, and she also shared concerns about other children. And the police didn't take any action, but they passed the concerns back to social services. And ordinarily, you'd expect social services to still take action because the threshold is very different for them, for them to act than what it would be for the police. But because the police didn't, they said, okay, we don't need to, so they did nothing. And then in March 84, 4 boys were actually expelled from the beaches and thrown out late in the evening. So I don't know what led to that, but they found themselves some miles away, and they contacted the emergency out of hours team. And at that point, one of the boys made allegations of physical abuse by Beck and another care worker. But because these children had learning difficulties, some of them were sniffing glue. Their concerns were dismissed because they were seen as not reliable. So yet again, nothing was done. And then in January 85, a 16-year-old boy told his social worker that he'd been beaten and sexually abused. And this time the information was passed to the deputy director. But he thought, well, nothing could be done without a formal complaint being made, which is just astonishing because the complaint had been made. So the police were not informed. And it's very, very hard hearing this not to think that there was some level of active cover-up, because I think this goes, in my mind, it's a very personal view, goes way beyond just negligence. There were more allegations in August by another boy, and the police investigated this, and they concluded that there had been accidental touching of the boy's genitals, and the council didn't carry out any further inquiry. But then in November 85, a social worker on placement wrote directly to the director to report concerns. And again, nothing was done. In 86, there was a complaint of sexual abuse, and that finally ended Beck's career in Leicestershire. And this complaint was abuse against 2 of his staff, which I think had gone on for several years. And on the 4th of March of that year, Beck was suspended. And once he was suspended, there followed more allegations by different people. And not long after that, later that month, Beck actually resigned. Now, his resignation shouldn't have been accepted, because then he could walk away, but it was accepted. But unbeknownst to the council, the police at the time were conducting another investigation, but they weren't given the information by the council, because if they'd added all that together, possibly Beck would have been charged at that time, but that didn't happen. And after Beck had left, he was actually given a reference by the director of the council at that time, a different person to when he'd started. This was a man called Brian Rice. And this enabled him to take up jobs in other areas with other authorities where it seems he did continue to abuse children. And then he was finally arrested in 1989 following the disclosure by the mother. And that then went on to lead to the large-scale investigation and the trial. So I deliberately haven't kind of gone into too much detail about what these children endured, because it is just really horrific, and it's hard for people to hear, I think. But you can see, I think, from what I've said, just how extensive and horrendous it was. And the themes here, the vulnerability of children and how they come to be vulnerable, how their concerns are dismissed and not taken seriously. Abusers are allowed to continue abuse because of the failures of the system. And children were told that no one would believe them. They were told that no one cares, including their families, that they're worthless. They were often threatened that worse things would happen to them if they told. So one girl had been in a psychiatric unit, which is closed now. It's called the Towers, and quite a notorious place. And she was threatened that she would be returned there if she told what had happened. Another girl, was a lesbian, and she was abused because of that, and also because she'd witnessed Beck abusing a boy. And he said to her, "I'm doing this to you because you need a man." And he raped her. He had no interest in women sexually, but he raped this teenager several times, multiple times, because of this, as punishment. So there was a mix of different ways that he would. With boys, he would often ostensibly show them affection and give them gifts and so on, and create an emotional dependency. And with girls, it was just sexual violence and physical violence, and really putting them down. So I'll just come on and say a little bit about some of the common themes that we've seen we're now very familiar with subsequent cases that have hit the headlines. So the first, I think, is status, authority, and charisma. And we know that perpetrators will often seek out positions of authority and trust that gives them unchallenged access to children. We saw this with Jimmy Savile, with many people. And sometimes those positions are quite relatively modest. So being a school safeguarding lead. But again, within that school community, it gives somebody, it's a position of trust. And, they're the person that people go to discuss safeguarding concerns. In Beck's case, he feigned expertise in this therapeutic intervention. And he had, what was seen as a distinguished career in social services. And he was very highly regarded across the nation, not just locally. He had, he would receive visitors to the home, local councillors, the director, and even, I think, Virginia Bottomley, who later went on to become the health minister. She visited once, because these homes were held up as the paragon of child care practice. So he abused children really in plain sight. And at the trial, the defence his defence said, to the jury, said, "Could you really accept that nobody would stop Mr. Beck when everybody could see what was going on?" And he said, what we've heard is just so terrible. Can you really believe that if something was so terrible, surely somebody would have seen it and done something? So that was actually used against the victims, the fact that these things happened in plain sight. And the fact that I think we struggle sometimes, things are so horrendous that the best of us have utter incredulity that people could do such evil acts with impunity and so extensively. And of course, abusers kind of, they reckon on that, and that helps them get away with what they're doing. Beck flaunted his disrespect for those in authority. He disregarded the hierarchy. And that meant that he was, he had carte blanche. He was able to handpick the residents. So he chose which children would come, the most vulnerable children, the children that he was interested in. And also he would take children to stay with him in his own home.